Hello and welcome to the Left Wing Podcast. Will Slattery here with you, and plenty to discuss on this week's show. I am delighted to be joined in studio by Luke Fitzgerald. Luke, hello.
Hi, just dropped my pass there, Will. Yeah, still dropping passes all these years later.
Oh, nice. And constant broadcasting to delay, 2 seconds just to let you pick that up.
Yeah, very skillful. I can tell you've been doing this for a while.
Yeah, good to have you in.
Great to be in.
Yeah, good to have you. And Jonathan Bradley back with us once again. Jonathan, how are you?
Not too bad. Good to be here talking about another interesting weekend of rugby.
As always, and the good thing with having you on, Jonathan, we haven't had you on in a while. It gives us a chance to have a second post-mortem of the Leinster game because you weren't there last week to give us a debrief. So we might save that for a little later in the show. We also want to talk some Lions squad. We didn't get to sink our teeth into that. There was last weekend's URC action, Munster and Ulster on Friday night, condemning Ulster for the first time ever to the Challenge Cup. Next season they won't be in the Champions Cup. Connacht's season also pretty much done and dusted as well. They have one match left to play. They also can't qualify for the Champions Cup. And there's one or two other bits that I want to get to over the course of the show, Jonathan. But first, actually, let me throw something out to you and get your thoughts on it. This season has really become kind of a lost season, I would say, for Irish rugby. The national team had a very disappointing November internationals. We spent the whole month of November picking through errors and ill discipline and poor performances. The Six Nations started well, but petered out. And then France obviously came to the Aviva Stadium, recorded a big win. Ireland played very poorly against Italy. Then on the club front, Leinster, another European collapse. Munster, their coach leaves after 5 matches. They have a middling season. The La Rochelle game notwithstanding, it's kind of been now a fight to get even into the top 8. Ulster and Connacht both missing out in the top 8. Ulster for the first time ever not being in the Champions Cup next year. All of a sudden you kind of take a step back and you're like, Jesus, how have we gotten here? All of a sudden all the 4 provinces are kind of with lots of questions. The national team, not in disarray or anything by any means, but just didn't have a great season by their own standards. And now you're kind of thinking, where is Irish rugby at the moment?
Well, it's a year that promised an awful lot. I think if you had said after the first 2 rounds of the Six Nations that Ireland wouldn't make it 3 Six Nations titles in a row, which we spoke a lot about, would have been a huge piece of history, and that Leinster wouldn't win the Champions Cup, it would have been seen as a very disappointing ending to a season that looked like it was going to provide a couple, at least, real highs for Irish rugby. I'm not particularly surprised by what's happened at Connacht, what's happened at Munster, what's happened at Ulster, but we spoke at various points over the course of the season where certainly even more so with Leinster, we were thinking it was a case of, if Leinster don't win the Champions Cup now, then when will they win it? And given that Leinster supplies so many of the players to the national team, the fact that that group of players has now had a host of Champions Cup campaigns that feel like they've gone begging, but more so this one, I think this one hurts more than the other ones for all the reasons that we talked about throughout the years, the players that they brought in, the experience that group has, the fact that they didn't have to get past, an Antoine Dupont-led Toulouse, the fact that La Rochelle had fallen off a wee bit. I think there is just going to be that sense now around this group of players that as good as they are and for all the things that they have achieved, and as somebody who grew up watching Irish rugby in the 90s, I'm not going to say that, winning 2 Six Nations titles back to back and finishing or, losing 1 game to avoid going 3 in a row isn't a period of success. But there's going to be a sense around those players that they haven't delivered the ultimate highs that we thought they were going to maybe 3-4 years ago, whenever you include the World Cup in that. So I think there's a sense that this generation of Irish players have achieved an awful lot. They are part of a generation that feels like they have taken Irish rugby to a new level. But I think really going back to the World Cup in 2023, there's probably a sense that they haven't made the history that we thought that they were going to make.
I think we're going to look back on 2023 as the high watermark for this era of Irish rugby. You look back at that year, all 4 provinces made the URC playoffs. Munster ended up winning the URC. Ireland won the Grand Slam, looked really well primed for a World Cup crack. Didn't win a quarterfinal, obviously, blah, 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 about that part of it. But, we're very close to a team that lost narrowly in the final, beat the eventual winners in the pool stages. Obviously, Leinster didn't win the Champions Cup that year either. But we're operating, I think, at the level under Lancaster when they were really humming. Obviously, had that great opportunity against La Rochelle at home, which they squandered. But I do think, in terms of performance-wise, I think that was the high the high point. I think since then it's just been gradual kind of decline slightly, and now it's obviously the situation we find ourselves now. Not that I'm trying to paint a completely dispiriting picture, but I do think we'll look back on that year as where things looked like they were really, really humming.
Yeah, but I'm not. I wouldn't be despondent about that either. Like, I don't think. I think for this team, maybe it will be for this kind of group of players potentially. I think we're probably in a period where it looks like there's probably a little bit more transition has to happen. You have these periods in a team, like you never have. In Ireland, you're never going to have wholesale changes. It's not like in a football club over 2 years where you could have the whole team gone and it's a whole new crowd of, it just doesn't happen here. It'll be kind of more gradual. You want to introduce 2 or 3 players a year to the squad. And it looks like we've had 1 or 2 of those guys in, particularly in key positions. I think they still haven't figured that part out. That's probably the biggest reason this year why I think Leinster haven't been successful. And I think that's why Ireland haven't been successful, is that they kind of changed that position and went a slightly different route. It looked like the Irish team particularly had made a decision on that, and then they kind of rode back on it after November and kind of second guessed themselves and really backed a very young horse who I think is still developing in Prendergast. So yeah, like it's an interesting period to look at, Will. I think you could look at it in those terms, and you could say, "Oh, is it panic stations here, or is there But I don't think so. I really like our system in Ireland. I think it'll continue to produce top players. I think the provinces will do well. I think Ulster need to get a grip financially a little bit. There's a little bit of that going on in the background there. I think they'll do that eventually. And they've made some decent signings. It'll be interesting to see what happens coaching staff wise. I mean, this obviously a disappointing year for Richie and the team up there, and obviously for all the Ulster supporters and the Ulster team. But I like that Augustus signing. I think he could be a nice little piece of the puzzle for them there. I like some of the young players they've brought in. And key to me at Ulster really is what happens on the injury front. I mean, they've been just completely decimated at different junctures over the last 2-3 years there as well, to compound which has compounded some of the other issues they've had. So I'd like to see them stick with Richie. I think he's some good stuff there. I think they need to come on defensively. I think Connacht, that's the glaring thing with Connacht really, isn't it? They have probably over-delivered in terms of resources, but the stadium's coming on, and that's the last piece of the puzzle for me, is can they get that team spirit, or can they get a coach that really galvanises them on the defensive side of the ball? Because I think they've continued to produce on the attacking side, and have been actually quite consistent on the attacking side of the ball for, I think, quite a long period, actually. I think Connacht have since I've been playing it, I don't think there's been a year where I've said, do you know what, they're not a dangerous attacking team. So it's the defensive side of the ball for me, and can they compete with the bigger packs? Munster, interesting period. New coach coming in. I think that's a very exciting, or it seems to have been a very exciting appointment there. So I'm looking forward to seeing what he can do with that group of players. I think they've made some good players. Some good players have come in. I think Farrell's been good for them. I think he could be better. I think he could be better on the defensive side of the ball, particularly. But he's very good in attack, I think. And I like some of those players that got in from Leinster as well. And can Tom Ahern stay fit? There's a few things there, like how do they deal with the O'Mahony situation, Murray situation, like what happens there? Who steps into those big boots? So yeah, look, there's change. Is probably, I know I've gone from one to the other, and I suppose that was just my way of thinking it through an answer for you. I haven't got to Leinster there, but I think let's discuss that maybe in a bit more depth afterwards. But in terms of Ireland and Ireland and the other 3 provinces, I think it's not time to panic yet. There's change definitely, but I think not all bad, and I'm kind of excited about some of the things that are happening, and I wouldn't be too despondent.
Yeah, it's not that I'm despondent, but I remember, Jonathan, it's funny, after the World Cup, might have been 2024, that you do these pieces about what a team might look like in 2027, and our colleague Rory O'Connor did a piece, and I remember texting him being like, Jesus, if that's the team in 2027, Ireland having a chance of winning a World Cup, because to my mind it was just so starkly inferior to the team that had gone close in 2023. And you're looking at this juncture now. I know we're kind of jumping off into an Ireland discussion. I hadn't planned it, but Sam Prendergast has come in for Johnny Sexton or Jack Crowley. That was natural. He was retiring. Joe McCarthy has kind of come in at second row. But so from the team that started against the All Blacks in that quarter final, they're the only 2 changes really. The entire team besides that is O'Mahony will be stepping away now, but he was starting in the Six Nations, so that's one maybe other hole they'll have to plug in. But that's 80% of the team that is basically the exact same team, just 2 years older, and not as good potentially as they were in 2023.
Yeah, but we saw the same thing after 2019, where it was like Rory Best and Rob Kearney both retired, and Hugo Keenan, and then initially anyway Rob Herring came in, and it was really in the 2 years after that where we saw more change. The Andy Farrell's team initially was very much Joe Schmidt's team with 2 enforced changes, and it was only really in that sort of Lions summer, if you remember, whenever I suppose he really started to put his own stamp on it, really brought a number of new players in. There had been other players sort of filtering into the Six Nations, Keelan Doris and stuff, but like injuries sort of hampered that. Will Connors as well. But it was really in this time now, whenever we saw the team sort of properly overhauled. And I guess that's maybe why there's some concern over the fact that not only Farrell, but Simon Easterby as well won't be on this summer tour, because it's a great opportunity to get a look at some of those guys that could have been used as, I suppose, fresh blood coming into the team at a time when it looks like it needs a bit of regeneration. Because it's not to get too doom and gloom, but this is something that we knew that was going to happen. Even whenever we were all very high on Ireland in those first 2 weeks of the Six Nations, you could look at that team and you could look at the amount of players that were heavily relied upon and still are heavily relied upon that are, in their mid-30s already. So, yeah, whenever you project forward to the World Cup, which I don't necessarily believe in doing, but if you project forward to the next World Cup, there is going to have to be an awful lot of change over these 2 years, purely because of the age profile of the squad.
Yeah, and those pieces are just kind of done for, fun, not fun, but they're exercises as well.
It's important to be thinking about it.
Yeah.
There's no way every international team doesn't have now kind of, just one eye at least cast on that. So I think it's natural for us.
And I guess some of my trepidation is the fact that Ireland have actually had a really competitive under-20s teams over the last couple of years. They won trophies, but I'm looking at those teams now with a little bit of remove, and I'm not saying, these guys and those guys will be coming in a year or two times. There's no one really who's not involved with Ireland right now that I think should be knocking down the door, really. I don't think. That's where my kind of slight concern will be. Whereas I feel like in other years, I might have been more inclined to be thinking, 2 or 3 guys, he should be in. Whereas I actually do feel like Andy Farrell is probably picking the strongest team he has available. And I don't, because you sometimes see on social media various players being pushed, and I'm like, they're not they're like fringe squad players, maybe getting into a squad, not into a starting team potentially.
That's Farrell's strength, though, and he's, I think, throughout his tenure, that is his biggest strength. Almost, like a lot of people talk about the mood that he creates in the camp, but I think his biggest strength is as a selector. If we had been having this conversation 2 years out from the last World Cup, nobody would have said Hugo Keenan and Mac Hansen are going to be stars in the back three. At that stage, even James Lowe, there were huge doubts about James Lowe as well. So I think it's very hard to project forward whenever, in any circumstance, but especially in circumstances where you have somebody like Andy Farrell who can look at, as an example, Jamison Gibson Park whenever he's behind Luke McGrath at Leinster and say that's somebody that, with the right environment, could be one of the best scrum halves in the world by the next World Cup,
Yeah, it remains to be seen. As you say, that summer tour will be interesting. Ideally, we'll come away from those 2 matches, albeit against weaker teams, and have 2 or 3 guys that might feature come November when they go to Chicago to play New Zealand. So interesting conversation. We might park that one for now and move on to the weekend. Jonathan, Ulster, for the first time ever, will not be in the Champions Cup next year. Like a lot of their games in the last while, they had 20 points on the board around, relatively early in the game, couldn't score again despite having a lot of chances. Munster kicked on, pulled away, have 1 foot in the playoffs. They have a kind of a somewhat tricky game against Benetton, who beat Glasgow well last weekend, a reasonably strong Glasgow team. But from an Ulster perspective, it brings 1 game to go away to Edinburgh, which is a dead rubber, but brings a tough season to a close. And how damaging is it not to be in the Champions Cup? We've often joked on here, or semi-joked, I guess, about how Ulster, maybe they could do with a run in the Challenge Cup to, win that and get some confidence. Now,
I wasn't joking about that.
Yeah, maybe I wasn't either, actually. But we said it so many times that, as Jonathan would always point out, it kind of is predicated on the fact that Ulster go on and actually do well in the tournament, which they seldom have done. But how damaging is it for them to be dropped down a level from the financial perspective, the prestige, what it just means for the brand after 30 years?
Well, I think the financial aspect is big. The numbers are somewhat murky in terms of the reporting of how big an impact it actually is financially. But if you are a rugby team with financial problems, as Ulster are, the financial problems are now coming home to roost, as it were, on the pitch, where you don't have the squad for the rigours of URC Champions Cup rugby, and you don't have the squad to deal with the injuries that they've had this season, which is a huge part of why they're in the Challenge Cup next season. So if you're then losing out on income by missing out on the Champions Cup, then it's one of these things where problems beget problems, in the sense that you're now going to have less money again to work with because of something that has happened due to a lack of money, essentially. So it's one of those things that you would worry about getting involved in a spiral where you need money to get out of this situation. You need to generate more income to get out of this situation. And performances on the pitch are ensuring that you're generating less income. So that's a big concern. In terms of the prestige factor, I think it is there as well, to a degree, but a less tangible degree, because the fact of the matter is, as anyone who's watched this team closely over the last couple of years will remind you, they haven't looked like they've belonged in the Champions Cup for quite a long time. Like, they have made the last 16 twice in recent years by winning one game, and their record in the Champions Cup, going back to the first leg of the Toulouse last 16 game, whenever they beat them and then lost the return game in Belfast and ended up going out by a point in aggregate. Their record has been terrible in the Champions Cup. Like, they've been hammered by some teams in the Champions Cup. They've had some fairly dark days in the competition over the last couple of years, and it's what I suppose makes the game against Bordeaux in the last 16 there almost feel like a bit of a quirk, because they went and gave it a big rattle against the team that we, I suppose, are in a final, have a really good chance of winning it. And, not that Bordeaux were ever worried that day, but Ulster did sort of go and fire a shot, which is something we haven't seen them do that often in this competition. And it's now, I suppose, a source of frustration for a lot of people that it's going to be a full year before we see them back in the competition now.
Yeah, look, it's funny because Richie Murphy, after the game, when it was kind of pretty much confirmed that they weren't going to be qualifying, had a quote, and he said, "You can't put 20, 21, 22, 23-year-olds out there and expect them to hit the ground running when they are playing against some serious high-level international players. There's going to be an area of growth." And he was kind of been pushing that a lot, but I often do, but I've said this a lot this season, like, especially recently. I've often looked at the team sheet and I've seen it stacked with players that recently were playing for Ireland or around the Ireland squad or have been highly touted. Like, there have been a couple of players who've been exposed over the course of the season. His son is one player who's actually been playing pretty well. But, like, I don't think it's the case that it's been a completely callow team all season or anything like that. I've often seen them with good players out there play really, really poorly, and I think they should definitely be higher up the table than they are. Like, they lost at home to Zebre, like. That game alone, getting a 5-pointer there alone would have put them in the mix coming this weekend. So, like, I feel like it's an easy thing to kind of point to. Obviously, they have had injuries and there have been young players playing, but at the same time, there's also been like some good team sheets put out in the last maybe 2 months that have drastically underperformed.
Yeah, but I think the big challenge for them is, like, it has been the injury thing, Will. It's like, so it's fine having a team come back and have a Freddie Starso one for one game, but really that's not, like, what you need is that team playing together for, 10 or 15 weeks of the season. Fair, you want that team, the majority of that team, to be together for a good portion of the season, and that really hasn't been the case. They've kind of got them back for big games, and I think that's why you see them at times running out of gas, like being able to fire a shot but not getting the job done. I think at times they look a little bit disjointed. And I think that's a factor in it. And I think he is right, generally speaking, over the course of the season. It's been kind of a fairly young team, and they've been fairly patchwork at times in terms of who they get out in the pitch. And I think the ideal scenario is that you have, yes, 3 or 4 of these young guys who are kind of finding their way, but you have them out with the likes of a Henderson, a Stockdale, a John Cooney, or whoever it may be, that are kind of the senior players in that group, Will. And I think, even Herring, I suppose, had some injury. Usually he was kind of Mr. Reliable. He'd do like nearly the full season for you without getting injured, but he's had a couple of injuries this season as well. So your senior guys are not there to guide them through and help you out. Like, I always remember Joe Schmidt was always great at that in Leinster, whereby he'd kind of introduce 3 or 4 guys into a squad, but it wouldn't be wholesale changes. You could be out there next to Brian O'Driscoll or Jamie Heaslip or whoever it was, and they kind of help you through. And I think that's a big factor. And I think maybe he hasn't, look, it's an interview after a game. He's not going to be able to particularly get into the absolute finer details on that. But when I think about every time I've watched Ulster this season, that's what I noticed with them, is that I think, yes, you might in a big game have lots of the big guys back, but they haven't come into it like on the back of 4 or 5 games where they've been injury free and they're kind of hitting their straps. It's kind of, we got him back for the big game. Let's see what he can do. And every time you look at some of the guys who've played a couple of games in a row, like I think Stockdale's been on a decent enough run the last while. I think that's because he's had a few games in a row. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think that's a factor that maybe it's hard to articulate in a 30-second interview after a game.
Yeah, I'll bring Jonathan in because you would have been watching them very closely. Like, who's closer to being right here, myself or Luke? Because, yeah, as I said, like, I kind of looked at that Richie Murphy quote, and I kind of did have a look at the team sheets, and we kind of supported some of what he was saying, but also some of what I was saying. Like, there was a couple of positions where they were young at various stages, but I also did think there were guys who, say that sliding door semi-final against the Stormers is referred to a lot as a moment that could have really, finally got that trophy over the line. They played the Stormers, remember, in that madcap game maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago. The team sheets were pretty close to being identical. I think like 10 or 11 of the starting team from that semi-final were playing in that game. So those guys are still around. So what's the truth of what Richie is saying and how Ulster feel the teams this year?
This isn't to be overly diplomatic or anything, but you're both right.
The worst answer of all time.
The lack of consistency in selection is huge. So it's not just say that Ian Henderson's only played 10 games, although that has an impact, but it's the fact that only 3 players in all competitions have made more than 15 starts. And one of those players in Dave McCann has sort of bizarrely, in my opinion, disappeared off the radar over the last couple of weeks and hasn't started in big must-win games, despite the fact that he was playing very well over the first half of this season and all of last season. So missing out on that consistency of selection, because everybody essentially, apart from 3 or 4 players, have had their seasons impacted by injury, and it's just been a very bitty season because of that. But there's also just been some massive underperformances, and there's been some just very strange games and strange halves. Like that second half against Munster was the 6th time this season where they haven't scored a point in the second half. Like, I find that absolutely incredible for that to happen 6 times in a season. Throw in the fact that they didn't score. Now, I know the weather conditions were bad, but they didn't score in the first half against Zebra in that loss that you mentioned earlier. Well, that's 7 halves of rugby over the course of a season where you fail to score a point. Like, that's mad stuff to me. And then you throw in the fact of, in 2 of those games, they were 19-0 up. So they were 19-0 up against the Sharks and lost. They were 19-0 up against Cardiff and lost to surrender 2 19-point leads at halftime over the course of the season. And as you mentioned, the loss to Zebra. Now, they ended up losing bonus points in those, but at halftime, they were on course, because they'd scored 3 tries, obviously, so they were on course for 5-pointers. So that's a 12-point swing across only 3 games. Like, you look at how important that would be in the course of the table, and that was there for them. So injuries have been big. Injuries are made all the more important by the fact that they don't have the experience in the squad anymore, because all those guys, the likes of Jordy Murphy, Luke Marshall, Craig Gilroy, Marty Moore, guys that weren't in the Ireland picture anymore, but had that experience and weren't even necessarily starters come the end of their tenure. But whenever somebody was injured, those were the guys coming in, rather than it being a 20-year-old who's making a second ERC performance against, all of a sudden he's playing, Leinster, or he's playing Munster or whoever. And I think that's a huge part of it. But I also think it can be true that even with that context, they've underachieved by being 12th in a 16-team league with some teams that just aren't very good at all. And it's through some of those games where they just either haven't turned up in the second half, or games that they've lost that on paper, like you say, well, the team has been good enough to be doing better than that.
Yeah, and I take the point both of you made that, like, sometimes I've probably looked at a team sheet and said, that's a strong team, they should be doing a lot better. But if they haven't had the run of games and the build-up, that does maybe impact the performance. So, but I like that you said we were about right. I'll take that, and I'm happy to
get out of there, Will.
I'm happy to shake hands on that one, and we'll move on to the next point. So, from a Munster perspective, the thing that stood out to me, Luke, they won 38-20. It was a real madcap first 25 minutes. watched it on URC from the Gulf of Naples. Really packed in as much rugby as I could.
Life you lead, isn't it?
Look, I was on duty last Tuesday, much to my wife's chagrin. But Peter O'Mahony's performance, I really think, now obviously there's contract negotiations, obviously that played out, for a long time, but I really think he should be playing on for Munster next year. I've always thought that when he had no more international rugby left to give, because like the extra time off he get during the season to rest his body, I think he's still playing good enough to have a real big impact at club level. Now I understand there's maybe financial elements to it where he might not want to play on a contract that wouldn't represent international rugby as well, but just from a rugby perspective.
Why does that matter?
What do you mean?
Why does it matter if it doesn't represent international?
Well, as in money-wise, he might not want to be like...
Yeah, but you can make it up in bonuses or something.
Well, I'm not speaking for the guy. I'm just saying he might not want... He might be like, look, I'm happy to play rugby at X, but not Y if I'm,
Do you know the thing? So the what's interesting is, and if you saw for the leap for the try, you see it with the sidestep, the power in the legs hasn't gone.
Springy.
He is but he was always super. It's a weird thing to say, but if you ever see the guy jumping, like do a counter move and jump in the gym, like he can jump out of the gym. Like,
his line out, that's why he's.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a reason. Like obviously he's got great timing and he's a smart guy as well. So like that obviously helps the line out too, right? But yeah, the thing that usually sorry, that was slightly different with me too now. But my career finished a good bit earlier. But usually it's your lower body that kind of gives out at this stage, and you say, you know what? I haven't got the pace, haven't got the spring, can't do the training days in a row, start pulling muscles, etc. And that's generally what you see with a guy who's got the miles on the clock like he has coming out. But I don't see that in his legs. Do you know, like, I mean, to my mind, it's always like in his shoulder but he's had that almost from day dot in his career, and he's just kind of gone all the way through. So I kind of, having watched him on the weekend, I was kind of thinking, yeah, is it really time to step away? But look, there comes a point where I'm sure we're seeing shoulder injuries, but I always think there's a bit of a neck thing there as well. I'm kind of thinking
he's had a lot of niggles. He's actually missed a lot of Munster time this year with various injuries.
I'd say he's missed a bit of Munster time over the course of his career anyway. Like he's always been there for Ireland, but it's always been like kind of getting, he gets in just in time for the big Munster game, just so he can kind of get, so he's available for the Ireland team. And it's always, he's been great at getting his body in shape for the kind of big matches, I always think, but he's been kind of unlucky throughout, it looks to me, with knocks. And when you have shoulder things, generally there's a neck thing involved. You see him sometimes with stingers and things like that, and he's always doing that thing where it looks like he's trying to get the feeling. I would imagine like that's where you're kind of getting into fairly serious stuff. A shoulder thing is kind of okay, that's a shoulder thing, but if it's a neck thing, you're kind of saying okay. And my suspicion is that with him, he's probably had a little bit of wear and tear there as well over his career. So I think, look, he's got young kids. I think he's a smart guy. I think he'll be set up pretty well financially. I mean, he's been on huge contracts pretty much his whole career, I'd imagine. So I would say financially, he's kind of set. He's a sensible enough fella, and
they'll be doing TV gardening shows within.
I heard from someone. I couldn't say what it is now, but I heard he's doing something interesting with a guy that I know. Thing. Yeah, no, not a TV thing. No, it's just in the kind of landscaping-y kind of space. So, look, I think he'll be well set up for what he wants to do next, and I think to my mind he goes out now. Kind of on top,
still playing well.
Yeah. So I think that phrase. I can't remember what the Jamie Carragher exactly was it leave the game before the game leaves you? I think it was a good way of kind of describing it. I think he is in that world now where he's gone out. He's been in the Irish team. He could have a strong finish with Munster now, provided they don't mess up this weekend. So yeah, I think and that was a great way to quit Tolman as well.
Yeah, losing to Benetton in your home city for your last game would be very underwhelming. So hopefully for his sake, they get the job done. Just as an aside, you mentioned that you obviously had to retire from injury when you were quite young. How long do you think you would have played, say, if you weren't injured? Would you have kept going until the absolute late 30s, or would you try to maybe, I don't know if you ever even thought about that?
Never thought about it.
You were too young.
Like you always are. You're thinking 35 is the number, isn't it? That you're going, okay, well that's where you step away.
Because you and Keith Earls are the same age, and he played well into his 30s.
Yeah. Although I had a very serious, I had a lot. He actually had a fair few serious injuries as well, but nothing on probably close to my ones now. But you were the areas.
You would have been happy to play into your late. Because that was something you would have liked to do. Do you think?
I was completely unprepared for my finish. Yeah. You just kind of I had never considered the possibility of having to retire until the doctor said that
Yeah.
it's not safe. Now that was the wrong kind of bang you got. So yeah, it's a funny one, and it hit me like a ton of bricks. Even though you would imagine that a guy like me who had some kind of serious injuries throughout my career would have had to have come to that point anyway in my mind, but I never really entertained the fact. And I remember I got a really bad injury in 2009, 2008, which kind of changed my whole career, to be honest with you. That big one, big leg injury, and like I was never the same after that. But I remember my dad saying to me at the time, and I was kind of thinking he might say, kind of sensible fella, he might say, listen, you've gone on Lions tour, you've won a Heineken, you've won a Grand Slam, like maybe we can call it there. I think it's been it's short, like it was 21 at this stage, but short but sweet, but he said, no, sure, like you have your whole life where you can't play sports again, like what I mean, once you retire, it's generally that sport for you and it's done. And that kind of stuck with me, so I said, you know what, I'll go till the wheels fall off. So I did.
Well, we might not have gotten to do this podcast, obviously, if you kept playing. So my career would have been different as well. So
maybe we could have been doing this while you would have been in school. Sorry, forget your age difference. But that's depressing.
I just wanted to be interested in what you said. Jonathan, any kind of reflections on Munster now after the Ulster game?
Yeah, I think it was a game that they were always going to win. I think in that situation of Thomond Park, the emotion of Thomond Park on the day, they were able to overcome what still looks like a pretty shaky line out, and there were some defensive errors there. And I suppose the reason I'm saying all this is I don't think they will beat a better team than Ulster with that performance, which is a concern, or should be a concern for them, because Benetton are a better team than Ulster. So
I think the Benetton game is actually like a tricky one. I watched that Glasgow game last weekend. I had two screens. I had the Ulster football final on the main TV, and I had my URC TV app on the laptop watching Benetton.
That was a boxing match, not a football match.
Yeah, so a bit of everything for everyone. But they have actually a very stacked team of internationals. It's like they're like the Leinster of like Italian rugby. Like they have 1 to 15 almost internationals.
Yeah, I mean they are a solid team, and if you look at the fixtures elsewhere, I mean it's shaping up to be an interesting enough weekend. Like I would say that Edinburgh will win. The Welsh teams going to South Africa adds another element to it that probably makes it quite difficult for them. But if you assume that Edinburgh are going to win against an Ulster team that have nothing to play for but pride, then all of a sudden, the loser of that game is essentially out. It's almost a knockout game before a knockout game, as it were. So it's a huge game, and I think the emotion of the last game of the season at Thomond Park, it'll be really interesting to see how Munster replicate that sort of home advantage playing in Cork. Obviously, it'll be, I think it's sold out, or nearly sold out anyway.
Sold out, yeah.
Already. So it'll be a packed stadium, but obviously a smaller stadium as well. So I just think it's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out for them, because they will, I think, need to be better than they were on Friday night.
Yeah, the atmosphere will be good. Like the atmosphere is always very good there for the 20s games when they have sellout crowds. So I'd expect, given it's Peter O'Mahony's last game and or last home game, and it's in Cork, to have a fairly cracking atmosphere.
Just whether you can sort of like tap into that emotion and go to that well twice in a week, because it became such a thing. Their last game in Thomond Park felt like it became such a thing. And it was almost odd that, it was their last game in Thomond Park, but it wasn't their last home game, because obviously this week's in Cork,
Yeah, but the thing is, I suppose, and this is made a brief comment last week on the show when we were discussing Leinster, but like the last Irish team to win a tournament was the Munster team, and they had to keep tapping into that, going to the well week on week at the end of the season, away from home as well, and that kind of an extra dimension to it, which they probably have to do now anyway, depending on how results go, of course. But yeah, like I don't think it's any bad thing at this time of the season to have to do that. I just think you have to manage the training load well, and it might play in their favour.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because that brings me on to my next point.
Leinster, obviously.
Leinster. And this is a good one, because it's about the week-on-week element, because we've talked a lot about, I suppose, do they wrap their players in cotton wool too much ahead of the big games? And so I did some research. I want to put these numbers to you and get your opinion on them, what you think. So Leinster have failed to win the Champions Cup 7 years in a row now. So it's 7 seasons. The team they started in their last Champions Cup game, so that's 7 times 15. That's 105 players.
Let's say it again.
So 105 players across the 7 seasons. Okay. Only 20 of them started the week before. So 85 of the 105 players did not start the week before that last Champions Cup game. So that shows you how undercooked they or how like much they've wrapped those players in cotton wool. Like, you know, only.
And is it only the one? So did you check it for 2 weeks before? Do you remember there was a year where I think they nearly did 2.5 weeks before?
I'm glad you asked me, because this year 11 of the players that started against Northampton didn't play for 3 weeks in the build-up.
Yeah.
In 2023, when they lost to La Rochelle at home in the Aviva in the final, 11 players didn't play in the 3 weeks leading up to the final. In 2021, when they lost to La Rochelle in the semi-final, 11 players didn't play 3 weeks in the build-up. And in 2019, when they lost to Saracens, 11 players didn't play for 3 weeks in the build-up. 11 starters, that is. So 11 starters, 4 of those 7 years didn't play a game for 3 weeks in the build-up.
Yeah, like it's definitely one of the issues. I think, like we've talked about Ulster and not having that consistency because guys have been injured, not playing together, and not playing week on week. And I always think towards the end of the season, like you just kind of pull guys with 20 to go, like or 50, or you know with 30 to go. You kind of pull people, and that was kind of how the teams I were on managed that. Do you know what I mean? So you kind of manage the minutes that way. And yeah, I definitely think that that's an element of it, that they come in undercooked. It's not an issue until you come up against a team with self-belief who's actually going to stick around in the fight and who's been in a bit of a dogfight themselves. Like I think that's always been something that I've felt like when you come up against, you know, the French teams at this time of the year or the English teams, they could be fighting, they could be playing matches against a team that might be like kind of bottom of the league, but they could be away from home. And these guys could be fighting for their professional lives. Do you know what I mean? Because if they go down a division, most of these guys will be out of the job. So these are dogfights that they're coming, and like they all have to play the week before they play these matches. So I feel like they're in way better condition to do it now.
For me, the point you made about the 2 weeks before is more, I suppose, because like the week before, because I checked what their opponents did as well, and bar Northampton this time, where Northampton played, I think their entire team bar one player the week before.
What about Northampton last year? I think they did the same thing though.
I only checked for the games, the last game. You're right. Though.
I think they did play their guys. Remember, there was the conversation point that week.
Say like Toulouse and La Rochelle in the build-up to the Leinster games finals, they also would have rested them the week before, but the week before that they would have played the majority, whereas Leinster, as I read there, on the last 3 seasons, only 4 of the Leinster starters played against Ulster this year 2 weeks beforehand. 9 of them played against the Ospreys 2 weeks beforehand the year before, and 4 the year before that. So in the kind of the period between the Champions Cup semi-final and the Champions Cup final for the last 7 seasons, Leinster have very much put the lads on ice. And it's funny because it's been 7 years in a row of it pretty much. So you would think that maybe by year 5 or 6, Jonathan, they'd be like, perhaps the week before, even if we're playing only a team, Munster in the Rainbow Cup, or, well, actually one of them was a Munster semi-final, which you've talked about at length.
So you've got to accept some risk, guys, don't you? I mean, it's not just in your game plan where you've got to be risking things in games to get ahead and kind of challenging things. It's in your selections too, in a very physical game. I think you've got to take some chances there. I don't know what Jonathan's view on it is. My view, I think, and probably shared by most people, is that it's definitely something that they have to think about and get right, because it doesn't feel like they're right. And nearly cost them more so. Northampton was where it really reared its head to me last year. I was thinking, wow, like they're a way better team than these guys, and they looked undercooked towards the end of the game. They looked really undercooked.
Just to reiterate one more time, because I probably did an absolute hames of explaining these numbers. Of the 105 players that have started the 7 Champions Cup Champions Cup defeats, 85 of them did not play the week before.
Yeah.
So that's a huge number. So Jonathan, sorry, just wanted to reiterate in case I've lost anyone.
Yeah, no, that feels really stark to me. And it feels like whenever you're talking about something 7 years in a row, that you would try and do something different. To me, 2 weeks feels too much of a break regardless. I know that sometimes they're having to manage minutes. The fact that they're bulk suppliers to the national team makes things more complicated. But to me, you would just, if you were in this run where, yes, there are some times when it's been a bounce of a ball, sometimes you've come up against a really good team. But if you're setting something as your start of season goal 7 years in a row and come up, well, let's say 6 years in a row, because I suppose we're saying that they didn't try something different this year. Presumably they will next year. But if you fail in your overriding objective 6 times in a row, you think you would try something different. And that to me would be something that would jump off the page to me as something that you would try to do differently. The team selection with Leinster, because they have such depth across the board, is always going to be something that's debated. I think if you remember whenever this run started, the debate was whether the URC or the Pro 14 as it was then was actually hampering Leinster because they weren't having to play their full team to win, or I suppose essentially to finish top of the league to get the top seeding for the playoffs. Like, that's obviously now something that has changed because they haven't won that competition in a while either. But I just think that if I was to be looking at it in terms of selection, Luke would obviously know a lot more about it than I would in terms of how ready you feel for a game. But whenever you see the way that they come out of the blocks in that Northampton game, yes, they got themselves back to a point where they could have won it, but they were very, very slow out of the traps. Whereas Northampton, obviously, buoyed by what you guys have talked about this last week, but like they talked about how last year against Leinster, they showed them far too much respect. And by the time that they realized that this Leinster team wasn't firing on all cylinders, it was too late. Whereas they came in with the knowledge of this time that they didn't show Leinster that same respect. And when Leinster had the slow start and didn't look like they were immediately at the races in a Champions Cup semi-final and were instead relying on being able to move through the gears, Northampton had already built up enough of an advantage and established enough of a foothold in the game that it was too late. So for me, and I remember writing this in my match report at the time, like to me it seemed really obvious that Leinster started too slowly, and whether it is true or not, the perception is always going to be that that's because they are undercooked coming into the game. They're not prepared for the game because they're not battle hardened for the game.
I think it's only one strand to me though as well. I think if you look at the team selection, like it looks to me like you don't pick Porter to start the game. You've Conan and Baird on the bench. Now, Baird obviously is kind of in a situation with James Ryan being injured, whereby he's kind of covering that second row slot. So it's kind of more forgivable there. But I don't know. I just felt like they didn't pick the team to go out and demolish them at the start of the game with everything that you got. And then, bring on the cavalry then to finish the job, or if you like, or to compound the bashing that you've given them for the 50, 60 minutes. They're going out to go, oh, let's hang on for 20 minutes and let's really roast them in the last six. I just didn't like it. It felt like it nearly the lack of respect they showed for the importance for the start of the game. It kind of seeped through into everything, and it was like part of that was the selection, part of that was how they weren't able to re-emphasize, like how there's not a message that comes on to the team when they're under the post having conceded the second try and go, like, stop offloading. Like, can you just carry it into contact, please? Nice low body height, and let's have 2 or 3 guys just punching in behind them in the ruck. Let's not give them the ball for 10 minutes here. How that message doesn't come on. So I think this is a part of it. The selection thing is a complacency thing as well, to my mind. It's probably a restriction with the IRFU, which is very difficult for them to manage. But at some point, you need to push back.
It's a restriction with the IRFU.
I know it is. Well, definitely it is. Like, they are bulk suppliers during periods where like other teams have rest.
Well, which party? When you say?
Well, I would say there's minutes restriction, but I also think I'm saying that's one strand of it. There's probably a minute restriction with some people. I'd say there's also a restriction around Geordie Barrett, which I think Leo has said that there isn't, but I think we saw Rory O'Connor did an interview on another podcast, I think after ours, and said that he thinks he was quite. He was almost like a legally type answer that he was kind of giving around that. He says, because I know you guys threw it back in my face saying that that wasn't a thing in the interview he gave it, Rory. Rory actually did an interview afterwards with someone told me that apparently kind of was backing what I was saying, which is kind of the word that was going around the camp at the awards ball too, around Geordie Barrett, that selection. So
the fact that he started against Zebra was hilarious.
Bizarre.
Well, the fact that he started against Zebra was amazing against Zebra. Admittedly, it was Zebra, but was also so good when he came off the bench against Northampton. Like, for the optics of that selection, nothing could have been worse than how Barrett played when he has been on the pitch around it.
He gets man of the match either side of being benched against Northampton. Like, it is.
But like, in saying all that, like, guys, so yeah, there's these are definitely things that they need to get, I think, a bit more right. They need to figure out, some of the select. I don't agree with holding back your best players at the start of a game, particularly against a team that are underdogs, because it gives them belief. Away from home, like they were 18-1 underdogs. Like, don't give them a sniff. And at the start of the game. Go full bore from minute one. The Porter selection makes no sense to me. Like, he regularly puts in 80-minute performances for Ireland, or 75 minutes at least for Ireland. These games are not played at the same pace as an international. So that's another thing I think that was wrong. I really liked Deegan as a player, and I thought it was good to see him kind of get. Part of me was like, that's great to see him get rewarded, but at the same time, I think he's a top of the ground player, if you know what I mean. Like, I think I would have had someone who was kind of a bit more physical in there. I think Baird or Conan, perhaps. I think I would have had in there ahead of him. Although that wasn't, he's not a major factor, but that was just a part of it. I thought that I wouldn't have selected him. I would have selected one of my big guys in there. But I think the team did not play well. Like, Robbie Henshaw is still a top quality operator, and he's not been at Barrett's level, but he should still be enough for that Leinster team to go ahead and beat. Like, it's not him being selected is not a reason for Leinster to lose that match. Like, they were complacent, they were off the pace.
That's not the
their
point.
Effort was wrong.
That's not the point. I don't disagree that the team that they picked ought to have still been good enough to win the game, but it's just not a good message to send. Like, putting your the form player on the bench.
No, I think it's right. I'm not saying it's not a problem, but I'm saying it's not. It's a small part of the problem. There's lots of different factors there, I think, at play.
Jonathan, I want to read you a quote from Jack Conan. And another thing that got a lot of attention was the end game when the penalty was given with around 4 minutes to go, and Conan was kind of frantically shouting to the sideline. He was talking about it after the Zebra game, and I'll read it to you. He said, "I was kind of like, 3 points down. Obviously, the last mile we'd scored a try off, so I was trying to talk to the sideline to say, what do you want to do? Then I turned to Sam Prendergast, and he was like, let's go to the corner, let's back ourselves. All the forwards at the same mindset, so you row in behind everyone, and look, another day you get another mile try, and then no one is talking about it. Because I was the captain, that falls on me. It's tough to take those learnings. Maybe I should have just put my foot down and been like, let's take the 3, even it up, and whatever happens, happens." I find that quote very interesting for a couple of reasons. So, Jack Conan is the captain. He's thinking of what to do. Then he thinks he needs to turn to the sideline. Then he thinks he needs to turn to Sam Prendergast. Then he's saying, now I'm talking to all the forwards. And that really does actually hammer home how frantic it looked to me. Like, it was a lot of asking and pointing and checking. And like, Sam Prendergast, I'm surprised wasn't like, give me that ball, I want to put this between the sticks. Like, he hadn't been kicking well. He's a young player. I guess maybe that fed into it. But I found that a very interesting quote. And I really like listening to Jack Conan. He's probably my favourite player to listen to. I think he's very...
It was a great interview.
Very good speaker, and kind of will give you an insight into what he's thinking. So I'm not like hammering the guy or anything by any means. I'm just saying that actually is quite illustrative of what I was seeing, I think. What do you make of those quotes?
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that whenever you're in post-match press conferences, you always do get the impression that it's far more collaborative a process than a lot of us would think that it is, of the captain making the decision. You always interview captains afterward and ask what was the thought process there, and they'll always say that you gauge the mood and the tempo and the feeling from a sort of leadership group rather than anything else. To me, I think like Conan taking an awful lot of heat for this. The interesting part of it to me is the fact that if somebody in the Leinster coaching box wanted them to take 3, they can radio down in time during that commotion and send somebody on with a tee, and then they have to kick it. So if there was messaging from above that they should have taken the 3, or if calmer heads in the coaching box thought that they should have taken a 3, it's not like there wasn't a method for them to get that down to the pitch,
That's a good point, because, sorry to come in, but because Leo Cullen after the game was obviously asked about it a lot, like, were you sending a message down? Because Conan was looking to the sideline. He said, no, we backed the players on the pitch. But like, given there was confusion and like, what do we do? Like, is it not incumbent on the coaching staff then to be like the cooler heads and say, because it's funny because
but he wasn't so he was the captain once the captain went off injured. Like, I think it probably would be Caelan Doris would have more confidence to make that decision himself and take on.
Conan's a more senior player.
No, but yeah, he's not the captain of the team.
But I think that plays into the idea that there should have been, or there could have been, word from the sidelines.
No, I think that's right, Jonathan. No, sorry, I think that's a good point to make. I think Conan coming on, like, if he's the captain of the team, if he's been selected as a captain, like, I would have thought Gary Ringrose, for example, would have been a better person to have been made captain after that. It's kind of a calmer head. He's more experienced as captain than Conan. He's not there as long as Conan, but he's pretty much there. He's a seriously experienced player, and I like Gary has done the co-captaincy, so like he's more. I would have thought he was in a better position to be making that call than Jack Conan, also having been on the pitch for all of the game too. So I think there's something that they need to get right there, and as well, like I think there's something else that will have come out of. I would hope that would have come out of the last couple of years is. Do you know what you always hear Bill Belichick talk about? Is the situational football? It was the Bill Belichick thing where, like, I wonder have they gamed out these scenarios and what they're thinking, because for me, where that kick, like if it's on the touchline, I'm saying, oh, we're that close. Maybe we don't go for goal here. Maybe we go to the corner. It's been going well. Maybe I'm not going to take a 50%, or is it 40 or 50% chance of getting one on the touchline? But when you're around the 15, the percentages change. And I would have said to myself, guys, if we're in this situation, we're going to live and die with what happens with the kicker.
And that's why I think, though, the message should potentially be coming from the sideline in that moment, because like the players, their blood is up.
Well, when the captain has gone off, and if you haven't picked Gary, who's been on the pitch the
there's
whole
clearly
time,
confusion about what to do. You have coaches in the box. Like that's why the South Africans of all people with the yellow and the traffic light system, like waving their cones in the air, like as in because
calmer heads.
Exactly. Like those guys are meant to be like outside of the emotion bubble or the passion, because there was clearly like the guys were G'd up in that moment and they didn't really know what they should do. And like even like Conan, saying I turned to Sam Prendergast and Sam Prendergast like, let's back our guys, and the forwards are all like, let's back our guys. That seems to be how it went. So I do.
Well, once you make a decision, you got to commit to it anyway. So that's fine. I don't have a problem with that part of it. That doesn't, to me, everyone's reaction after it doesn't make it the right thing to do. Like the right thing to do is to go, I think, not by your gut all the time. I think sometimes, like earlier in the game, it's probably okay to have you have a bit more leeway. But at that juncture in the game, hasn't gone well. Yes, you're on top in the second half, but like they've also scored in the second half too. You could feel the momentum was with them, but kind of probably more narrowly. And I think if you think about the percentages of like a goal kicker's percentages, and let's say there's a range because of the pressure and that's on this kick, the guy's age, his inexperience, etc. But still, a goal kicker at this level, even if they're kind of low percentages, would be between 65 and 85% chance from the 15, I think. And I would live with that percentage, saying, okay. And also the backstop here is that if he does miss, you get the ball back, so it's not over. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. So like they're the key factors there. To me, that was a no-brainer of a decision, but it's because you have the backstop, but also the percentages. And I think they have to game out those scenarios a little bit better. I always think you think of the Chiefs in the. Who was it against Philadelphia, or I can't remember who it was. Maybe it was against San Fran. Do you remember? They had gamed out the scenario that if they went to overtime, they, like the others, actually got the flip of the coin, but made the wrong decision. They hadn't gamed out the scenario correctly, whereas the Chiefs had. And this is another one of those ones where I think Leinster can learn from that, where they say, right, if we're in this situation, let's do this. You know what I mean? Because to me, it was like an option on the play, because you got the ball back afterwards, even if you messed up. So, yeah, to me, that was a bit of a no-brainer. Yeah, well, it was interesting to get that kind of, I guess, was additional insight into what the thinking was, or kind of setting the scene by Jack Conan. We will finish off with some Lions chat. The one disappointing thing about Leinster losing is that it really robs us of 2 weeks of podcasts as well, that we would have had our big meaty Champions Cup preview and our big meaty Champions Cup final review, which now I don't know what the F we're going to talk about. We're probably going to have to do debrief part 3, and we'll go into it again. Or Leinster, yeah.
We were going to be talking about them anyway, so we can just dig into their misery and their pain. But Jonathan, we'll finish off with some Lions chat. The squad was named on last Thursday, 38 players selected, 15 for Ireland, the record. Not that many kind of juicy talking points in the end. Actually, like it's funny, I would have thought I would have been raring to go, maybe a second podcast from Italy, but I said, look, we can have a nice relaxing day out instead, because in the end, I suppose it kind of passed without huge, controversy. Owen Farrell obviously was in the frame, but Andy Farrell didn't pick him, has left the door open for him. One thing I wanted to ask you though, Jonathan, if this squad wasn't picked by Andy Farrell, if it was picked by any replacement coach X, not from Ireland or involved with Ireland, how different do you think the squad looks? Do you think, like, how many less Irish players might be there? Do you think Owen Farrell actually might be in the squad, that maybe in the end it could have hindered him having Andy as the head coach? Anything you think might be different if Andy Farrell wasn't the man picking the team?
I don't know. I don't think Owen Farrell's form in France has been great. I don't think it's been strong enough in France that we can say that, it was an anti-nepotism selection not to go with him. I do think there's an argument to be made for it, but I think you're right in what you're saying, Will, in the sense that there wasn't an awful lot to really like sink your teeth into about this Lions selection. Like it was a very much a, I suppose, if you had have put 20 people in a room and taken the most frequent selections from everybody, I think this is near enough what you would have come up with. You could maybe make the argument, and I'm sure if you were Scottish, you would probably make the argument that maybe if somebody else is picking it, Darcy Graham would sit ahead of Mac Hansen. I could see that. I think there's a possibility that somebody who was thinking more about or more concerned about the ability to foster an atmosphere. I think Andy Farrell, because as we know he is such a good man manager, won't be too concerned about that. But maybe somebody who wanted to foster more of I suppose, a ready-made camaraderie, maybe bring somebody like Jamie George, possibly, if somebody else is selecting it. But I really think it was very much a down the line, as expected selection. Like, I think the fact that even in the age of social media, there's been as little debate about it as there has been. Probably
that is the best indicator, I think, to reinforce your point, is that there has been pretty much no hype about it.
Yeah, because I've been reading some of the English journalists, and I suppose like the people they're talking about being left out, I'm just thinking like they weren't even in the frame to begin with, so that's not even worth really getting too hyped up. And I agree with you.
I think a huge part of that is because of the Six Nations. Like, the last Six Nations in a Lions year that was won by France was 97. So you don't have that. You don't have as many compelling cases as you do normally. This is the first Lions year since they created the player of the tournament in the Six Nations that it was won by a French player. 10 of the 15, only 10 of the 15 names in the Six Nations Team of the Year, no matter what you think about the process of the Six Nations Team of the Year, only 2/3 of your team was drawn from outside of Italy and France. So I don't think you had as many compelling cases or as many definites as you would normally have. So it felt like, to me, there was just an awful lot of players of a very similar level, much more so than normally, because normally you'll have somebody making, whether it be teams or individuals, making real definitive cases for themselves in the Six Nations. And I just don't think that happened this year because of the way the Six Nations went, with Ireland starting so well, but fading, and then France being the dominant team.
And I think as well, Scotland were, in the big matches, they didn't show out. That made it kind of difficult, I think, in terms of them. Wales are obviously a basket case, and you've got, 2 or 3 guys there that were probably really within it. And I think they did well enough, to be honest with you. And look, Morgan definitely should be there. But like the situation there that they find themselves in, Faletau maybe is the only one. Maybe you say, well, that was an interesting one. He was good when he came in, and he's got the experience. But like that kind of really narrows it down. And England made such a poor. I mean, the match against Ireland, I mean, they were a complete no-show, which was their really only big game that they were really tested. Like they did well against France, but still should have lost that game and finished it like they walloped Wales. But like, I think they were kind of over-egged in terms of how far they've come. I think they've improved.
They still got 13 players though. They only got 2 less than Ireland. Yeah,
but that's my point, is that Scotland were a no-show and Wales are not really at the races at the moment. Anyway, they're in a rebuild, a complete rebuild, to be honest with you. So it's been a tricky one to try and select, and I think he's off the back of that. I think that's probably because there's probably a narrower pool to pick from. I think that's probably why we're in a situation whereby there isn't massive uproar over someone being left out or someone not being included. And as well, the fact that he's left some room for some experienced campaigners, possibly, or a bolter. Less likely it's a bolter, to be honest, but more likely an experienced campaigner, which I think would add value to this squad, if I'm being completely honest.
O'Farrell, potentially?
Well, Laws or O'Farrell, I think. I think they're the ones that would probably jump off the page to me. And if there's an injury, maybe a George, just someone who might, as you say, bring the squad, gel the squad together, have the experience.
It's funny, like Henry Pollock, by the time it was announced, wasn't even a bolter anymore. Because he's probably
the Irish pack he's played against.
Yeah, and he's probably like, I say he's a good chance of starting a test now. He's playing out of his skin.
Oh yeah,
it's funny how that worked. Like, it was a kind of a pipe dream, then it became a possibility, and by the end of it, he was like the first name probably in the squad. Caelan Doris, though, what a shocking week. You have to feel for the guy. So in 2021, he had missed a lot of time where he had concussion issues, so wasn't really in the frame. This time around, he goes from like captaining Leinster potentially to win a Champions Cup. They lose. Obviously, he gets the injury. He misses the Lions tour. It's just gutting for him, because he would have been could have been the captain, but definitely would have been in the inside track to start.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, look, part of me always thought Itoje might have been a nice selection, but actually they've got a good few guys in, as you said. In the end, I wasn't looking like that. Maybe for a period, England weren't looking like they were going to have as many as they did. Yeah, no, I'm absolutely gutted for him. I'm absolutely like he is such a good player. To have not potentially not going on a Lions tour now, we will see now. Hopefully, he keeps up his form and he sneaks in for one in the maybe in I don't know 4 years time. It's probably a stretch at this stage, but maybe
he'll be 31. Like
well maybe well he's a lot of miles on the clock though, that kind of way, and he's a few injuries. But look, let's see. So look, I think maybe he gets one in one of the big countries too. I think at the moment Australia are not as they won't be as competitive as New Zealand or South Africa. But yeah, I'm actually gutted for him. Really gutted for him. It's really bad timing. Obviously, it's stating the obvious, and yeah, it always happens to one or two, so hopefully we don't see any more. But like I'm sure the reality of playing rugby at this level, if you're playing late in the competitions, physical matches,
and it's tough. But like the player to benefit the most is probably Jack Conan.
Yeah, I think so. Although
he's like the only out and out number 8 really in the squad. Like Pollock and Earl have played there, but Conan's the only guy who week in week out wears number 8 jersey.
But Conan has been great this year. I have a feeling that he might have gone anyway. Will. Seriously, I think he was.
Oh yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I think he might have gone anyway. Like if you think about his impact, like he was a key guy for Ireland in the Six Nations. I thought throughout, I thought he was the big catalyst, one of the big catalysts anyway against England when he came on in that really dominant period in the second half. So yeah, no, I wasn't surprised to see him go, and he also has a Lions tour behind him, so that always helps you. I think if you're playing well, you've done one. Particularly, it's a kind of inexperienced, ishy type squad, in parts of it anyway. And he's a guy who's a bit of a leader. He's a good voice, good presence, and playing well. It wasn't a surprise that he was there.
Yeah, it'd be interesting because obviously, depending on who makes the various club finals, there could be a little bit of upheaval or guys not available for the first game in Dublin against Argentina, which will be a bit of an occasion, which will be exciting to see the Lions in Dublin. Jonathan, I'll give you the last word. Anything else with the Lions squad that jumped out to you?
I do think that point that you make about the number 8s is interesting. Like the balance of the back row to me feels a little bit open side heavy.
It's strange, and he picked 6 second rows as well. Like I feel like James Ryan really was added as maybe like. That's one actually I think if it was a different selector he might not have got in because he hadn't played a lot of rugby. I did really feel like the 6 second rows kind of jars. Now I know Byrne and Chesham can maybe play 6, but
I think that's probably where you feel like they're going to go though, isn't it? And then like it's whether he thinks that Pollock could do the 8 job for me. That's where I think that's where I think he's your option there. Personally, I don't know. Would you agree?
Yeah, sorry, Jonathan. I gave you the last word, and then I completely hijacked it. Very cruel of me. So sorry. Yeah, we have at it.
No, yeah, I just think the balance of that of the forward selections in terms of specialists in the back row and locks comeback rows, I think is interesting, and I also think it's interesting. I think it's much more interesting now trying to pick a test team than it possibly was trying to pick the squad because again. Especially with Doris out, because he would have been one of those guys you were saying as a nailed-on starter. Even the fact that we're talking about, does Pollock start at 7? Does Van Fleur start at 7? Ben Earl, I think the test team is because of this idea that there isn't that many players who made definitive claims during the Six Nations, and I suppose as well in the European games outside of that Saints contingent. I think it makes it much harder than we maybe thought it was going to be. Say this time last year to pick a starting test 15 as well.
Can I ask you, I know that was supposed to be the last word, but I actually want to ask you something that I'd be interested to hear your answer on. Do you think that Leinster and Ireland and even supporters, do you think they underestimate how important James Ryan is to the team?
Jonathan.
I have my opinion on it, but do you think so? Because obviously it's when you say he's maybe the one surprise in the Lions squad, I think it's a no-brainer to have him there. I've always thought that in the last one too. What do you think?
I would have had him there. To be honest, I would have had him there. If there was an Irish second row that wasn't going to make it, for me, it wouldn't be James Ryan. It would have been McCarthy.
Agreed. There you go. That's no surprise to me. And that's not a go with McCarthy, but I just think he didn't play well. He was very poor against Northampton. I think he's messier. I don't think he's as good in the line out. He's obviously very destructive at different points, ball carrying but I think Ryan for me is the key with Leinster.
Well, my point was more that he's missed time, not necessarily his ability.
Yeah, no, and that's fair.
He missed the back half of the Six Nations and didn't get to play, against Northampton either. So, it'll be interesting. We'll probably have to do a couple of shows picking our testing now that the Champions Cup final. There won't be much to talk about from an Irish perspective. We're going to have to fill some extra time that I had.
Look, it's an exciting fight. I do hope Northampton show up. But I think they're better equipped maybe to deal with the guys out wide than maybe Leinster. That'd be interesting. And if you can keep them quiet against Bordeaux, kind of goes a long way.
Yeah. Well, look, save this for next week.
Sorry,
we'll need something to fill next week. So,
sorry.
But for now, I'd like to thank Luke and Jonathan for joining me on this week's episode of the Left Wing Podcast. We will be back next week for another show. And in the meantime, you can subscribe to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or listen on the Irish Independent website. So until next time, thanks so much for listening, and goodbye.